Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. A grim warning from expert economists today that if the Treasury doesn't urgently delay the upcoming tax cuts, he'll force the Reserve Bank to hike mortgage rates again rather than cut them as hoped. Coming up, Ross Greenwood with more. Despite nearly 800 deaths directly linked to Victoria's hotel quarantine debacle, all criminal charges against 10 individuals have now been dropped. Gavin Silbert, former Chief Crown Prosecutor in Victoria, joins me as I want to know why the families of the dead are being denied justice. Plus, Nicolle Flint back having another crack at federal politics. I'll speak to her later in the show about what's next in this race for this Conservative woman to take back Boothby. And a new day and a new strategy for Labor when it comes to the detainees disaster. Well, this time it's blame the bureaucrats. But as Peter Dutton points out, this all goes back to the two hapless ministers.
I don't know who's got it wrong here, but we can trace it back again to Andrew Giles and Claire O'Neill. Andrew Giles is a strong factional ally of the Prime Minister, but he's a liability and just a weight around the government's neck at the moment.
Well, I'm going to rip into that detainee issue in a moment, but first, with the budget less than a fortnight away, it's clear what this government's doing. It's talking economic responsibility while practising the big spending and vote buying that's in Labor's DNA. It's hoping for an interest rate cut that would take some of the cost of living pressure off families, but its spending addiction means that the next interest rate move could be up rather than down. Here's the Treasurer downplaying the inflationary risk.
There was a pretty big overreaction, frankly, to the inflation number last week.
But every time the government announces new spending, which is virtually every day, well, that's all adding to inflationary expectations. Now take it this week alone. Tuesday, there was $1 billion given to a US quantum computing company to build an outpost in Brisbane, a business we need to remember that had employed any number of ex-Labor staffers to lobby the government. Professor Toby Walsh, an AI expert at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of New South Wales, said this in the Australian Financial Review today. He said, "I find it outrageous that the selection of Psi Quantum was decided in November by a secret expression of interest process." Now, as I've said all week, giving $1 billion of your money to a Californian startup, well, it's got a real stink about it. As Professor Walsh said, $1 billion is a heck of a lot of money for what the government promises is 400 jobs in Brisbane. Well, you bet it is. It's about $2.5 million per job. Yesterday, more money, just shy of another $1 billion, to help women escape domestic violence, which seemed as much about helping the PM to escape his embarrassment over the weekend's rally, because there was no move on the biggest issue, and that's lax bail laws in this country that puts men at risk of hurting their partners back out on the street. And today there's the offer of an extra $4 billion a year mind you, to states for public hospital funding. Again, something that seems more political than economic to buy peace with Labor premiers. Now, it's possible that despite all of this, there could be a surplus announced on budget night. That's because iron ore prices are up, and as is the case with a lot of the other resources we have, particularly energy, we ship them overseas, but increasingly we can't use them here at home because Labor and the Greens demonise them in favour of Chinese-built solar panels and wind farms. Now, if it eventuates on budget night, the Treasurer will trumpet the surplus as proof of Labor's management skills. But the difference between coalition surpluses and Labor ones is that the coalitions are the result of efficiencies in government spending and boosts to the productivity of the economy. Labor's surpluses instead are the result of higher taxes. In this case, should it occur, a higher tax take from the resources sector because of higher commodity prices. It's nothing at all to do with better economic management from the government. Indeed, because we already know that taxpayers, ordinary taxpayers like you via income tax, are paying more tax than business is paying. With this government, with the Prime Minister, it's only ever the politics that counts. Why else would it spend $40 million, $40 million, to advertise the coming tax cuts that everyone's going to get anyway? Look, yet more today too on the government's ongoing detainee crisis, as the Prime Minister's been caught red-handed in a lie. Now, we now know that the Kuwaiti man charged with bashing Perth grandmother Nanette Simons, who fronted court back on the 20th of February over the alleged breach of visa conditions, was granted bail unopposed by the Commonwealth. Now, Labor said yesterday it had opposed his bail, but they then had to backtrack fast when it was proven that lawyers for the Commonwealth did not oppose bail, and if they had, said the magistrate, she would not have granted it anyway. But it wasn't just this February appearance that matters here. This man, Majid Jamshidi Dushukagan, also fronted court on the 10th of April. He was charged then with trespass and driving on an expired licence. Now, shockingly, back then, he got bail again. And then 4 days later, on the 14th of April, he's back in court again, this time charged with a drug-related offence. Remember, he's already a convicted drug trafficker, but even that isn't enough to get him locked up. Yet again, he gets bail. That's 3 court appearances this year alone, and 3 times this convicted criminal has got bail. We then learn on top of all of this that sometime between that first February court appearance to when Nanette was allegedly beaten senseless by him, the ankle bracelet of this convicted criminal was removed. Now, why would you remove the monitoring device from a man charged with breaching his curfew? Well, that's beyond me. But when pressed again about this today, the Prime Minister tried to dodge responsibility, arguing that the body he set up to keep an eye on these 150-odd foreign criminals, that body, he says, they recommended this change, and that they are independent, says the Prime Minister, of the politicians.
Have they failed in this instance?
Well, the Community Protection Board is, of course, a board that's independent of politicians.
But have they failed?
Well, I can't. It's not appropriate for me to comment on individual cases.
Independent of the politicians, you heard him say. Only that is not the law. And not only is it not the law, it's not the law that the Prime Minister's own government passed in a rush last year. This is Albanese's own law, his laws, and still he's got no idea how they operate. Or he does. Or he does know. And he's hoping he can get away with blaming this fiasco on his so-called independent community panel. Because this panel's not independent. Everything they recommend, all of their advice, under Albanese's own legislation, must be signed off by the Minister.
Who is the final decision maker under the Migration Act?
The Minister.
The Minister is, right.
On the advice of the board.
On the recommendation of the board.
Yep, okay,
and the endorsement of the Commissioner.
Right, and so it's not sufficient for the Minister to pass the buck to the Community Safety Board. Ultimately, it's the Minister that makes the call on what conditions apply to people's visas and whether or not applications should be made to the court for a PDO.
No, the board doesn't address the issue of what the Minister should do in relation to a community protection order.
So on a question of, say, should someone wear an ankle bracelet or not, the final decision maker is the Minister, and your evidence is that can be delegated, but no delegated decision has been made on a question like that.
Correct.
Correct.
This is a shocker. I mean, this is the Prime Minister yet again found out trying to blame someone else for the failings of his own front bench when his own legislation says he and his ministers are responsible. That was evidence there from a whole lot of officials. Every time Albanese's under pressure, he tries to sheet the blame home to someone else. It's always someone else's fault, always someone else's responsibility. Now, we elect leaders to lead. not hide away when the going gets tough or play the weak man's game of blaming others. This is a Prime Minister who, frankly, is not up to the job. He's an emperor who's got no clothes now. And Australians are fast waking up to the fact that Albanese is all spin over substance and that they are all worse off. Australians are worse off as a result, both in terms of the money in their pocket and now, sadly, their families' security at home. All right, let's get those headlines. Cam Redden in Canberra.
Good evening. Another immigration detainee has been charged with allegedly breaching his visa conditions. The 42-year-old man, originally from Burundi, is facing 5 counts of breaking his curfew and failing to keep his ankle bracelet in working order. Bureaucrats are being blamed for a briefing error that led to cabinet ministers claiming bail had been opposed for another detainee accused of breaching his conditions.
The Minister just goes missing in action, can't explain why the department didn't oppose bail in this case.
Criticism too for the government's Community Protection Board, set up to provide advice on managing each detainee. One senior coalition source telling Sky News it's being used as a human shield.
Who is the final decision maker under the Migration Act?
The Minister.
The Minister is right.
On the advice of the board.
On the recommendation of the board.
Yep.
Freed detainee Majid Dukoshkin, one of the men charged with bashing Perth grandmother Ninette Simons, had his ankle bracelet removed earlier this year based on the board's advice.
Have they failed?
Well, I can't, it's not appropriate for me to comment on individual cases.
Mrs Simons raising her concerns directly with Immigration Minister Andrew Giles during a phone call.
I don't feel very safe here anymore, unfortunately. I don't. But I'm doing my best to live here.
With the budget less than a fortnight away, the OECD warns interest rates may need to go up before they come down. It believes stubborn services inflation may require tighter monetary policy than currently assumed, but does expect rates to be cut 3 times by the end of next year. The OECD's latest economic outlook demands spending restraint from Jim Chalmers' third budget, including tangible measures to rein in the costs of the NDIS.
All right, for the other big stories today and all of that as well, we'll bring in media writer for The Australian, Sophie Ellsworth, and the Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, Daniel Wild. Well, welcome to you both. We need to start, obviously, with this ongoing detainee crisis at the top. On the 20th of February, the man alleged to have brutally bashed Perth grandma Ninette Simons was bailed. The government says they opposed bail. We now know, of course, that wasn't the truth. They did not oppose bail. But we've now also learnt that after he got bail in February, this Q80 national fronted court on the 10th of April, bailed again. On the 14th of April, bailed again. And then 2 days later, on the 16th of April, police allege he broke into Ninette's home, robbed her and her husband of their life savings, and then inflicted those horrific injuries. Well, Sophie, bailed 3 times in less than 2 months. I mean, this government's in crisis control right now.
Well, Peter, that's shocking. But there's no other way to describe that. But where are the ministers? They have run for cover. Claire O'Neill did that Sunrise spot. Andrew Giles did that PM interview on ABC yesterday. Now, I have not seen them out today. They appear to be ducking all the questions here and staying well away from the media because, Peter, we've seen them in front of the media, and when they're under pressure, they do not perform well. So I think their strategy is obviously let's just hope this story moves along, and by the time they do eventually come out, journalists have moved on to another issue.
Yeah, but the strategy is to lie. I mean, Daniel, they lied about whether or not the Commonwealth had sought to oppose bail. We now know they didn't, but they certainly had talking points out there. You could say it was an error. I reckon it's a fudge. And I say it's a fudge because the Prime Minister gets out there today. This is his own legislation, and he says, oh, well, look, we've got to take their advice. This is an independent panel of all these experts. No, they don't. The panel gives advice to the minister, but the decision maker, as we just saw there confirmed by officials, is the minister. So he can't dodge this. He can't. The obfuscation, I think, is criminal.
You're 100% right, Peter. And this to me shows that there is a deep cultural problem within the Labor Party. The run out of the left faction in Canberra and in many of the states, they oppose the idea of controlling the borders. They oppose the idea of detaining and deporting unlawful entrants and criminals. It is inconsistent with their ideological worldview. So that's the fundamental issue here that we're seeing. The broader point as well, Peter, I'll make is it's not just these detainees, it's the entire migration program. Like we've been discussing, not working in our economic interests, we're going backwards, not working in our social interests, we're divided. You had a great piece today saying, look, this is now having national security implications. So as Sophie said, the ministers are nowhere to be seen, and there is a huge issue in our country right now.
Where's the teeth from the gallery? I mean, right now, if Tony Abbott had fibbed like the Prime Minister's done today, or if they'd said they'd oppose bail and they didn't oppose bail, honestly, Sophie, shreds would have been torn off him. If Philip Ruddock had gone out there in the Howard era and said all of this and got it so wrong, he wouldn't still be a minister. There's no doubt about that. These guys are surviving, and they are literally lying now on multiple times to save their skin. This is like Victorian press gallery. This is what it, this is the Andrews press gallery come to Canberra.
Well, Peter, I don't want to be critical of journalists, but they need to hold these ministers to account. You do have a large contingency of the media that is left-leaning, and this obviously doesn't fit in with their agenda. I mean, the ABC, we know, is left-leaning. The Guardian is extremely left-wing. You'd argue 9 papers are left-wing. So, they're not going to really go hard on this. But even the other day when the Prime Minister was up on that stage, in front of Parliament House, and Sarah Williams was very upset, imagine if that was a Liberal Prime Minister. Imagine if that was Tony Abbott. This would have been rolling coverage, endless coverage for days on end. But we haven't seen that, I don't believe.
We have an academic, an anti-Israel academic. She works for Macquarie University but was involved in a protest at Sydney University. Her name's Dr. Randa Abdel Fattah, highly critical of Israel, we get that, but now she has been criticised over the involvement of children and that intifada chanting that went on, investigated quite properly, I think, by Macquarie University. But anyone who's criticising her now is a white supremacist. But I've got to say, how on earth does she keep her $800,000 taxpayer grant?
Precisely. Look, I've taken the liberty of actually printing out what that grant was for, and I'll spare your audience the full spiel on it, but just to give you a flavour of where our money's going, the project she got the $800,000 to do was to study a neglected but constitutive part of Australia's social movement history, which is Arab and Muslim Australian social justice activism. It goes on to say it's going to recover previously untapped oral histories of Arab and Muslim Australian activists working in anti-racism, anti-war, feminist social movements from the 1970s. I don't know what any of that means. I'm sure that the people giving her the money don't know what that means. But here's the point, Peter. These dangerous ideas used to be safely ensconced away in the ivory tower of the university, and you could have these academics doing this. It's now spilling out in our society. The wokeification of our society, that's come from university academics. We're seeing it on our university campuses where, and I don't blame the students because they're uneducated, they're being taught a false view of our history, a negative view of Western civilisation. And it just shows that the Vice-Chancellors, they're cowards. Mark Scott foremost among them at Sydney University. They need to act on this, but they've gone missing in action.
Before you were the media writer, of course, you were a finance writer. Macquarie Bank announced today no more cash, digital only. We know that Bank West recently went the same way, but I mean, this is one of the first of the big banks. Cash is legal tender, but cash is basically soon to be extinct. Is that a good thing? I don't think it is.
Absolutely not, Peter. I think it's a shocking thing. Macquarie don't have a lot of branches in Australia, so I don't think that impact's going to be very big. Bank West is a different matter. But I think some people who are tapping their cards, they're not paying attention to the fees. Every time they wave their card, Peter, check what fees they're paying. And
even if it's FPOS too, it's not even that you're on credit.
That's right. And I have been caught in many situations. I love cash. I always have cash on me. I've been in many situations where you go into a shop, you go to pay, and their terminals are down, and then they say cash only, and you just see people walk out. No one has cash. there are situations where we need cash, particularly like if there's a flood or a cyclone, all the terminals are down. I think this is very dangerous if we have no cash in society, and particularly for older Australians, Peter, who love operating in cash.
You're not wrong. Of course, you're tracked if
That's
you're
right.
online and digital. Thank you both. All right, let's go now to Labor's Stage 3 tax cuts that are due to kick in within a couple of weeks. Today, expert economists were quite vocal about concerns they have that this cash injection into the economy at this fragile time could actually make inflation worse, and they're now calling for the cuts to be delayed. For more, let's bring in our financial guru, Ross Greenwood. Great to see you as always, Ross. Jim Chalmers says there's been a massive overreaction from people like you to inflation data released last week. But we have these tax cuts on the way. Now, small as they might be per person, you add them up and it's billions of dollars across the economy. What do you make of the concerns today from experts that this could spike inflation and could force the RBA to hike rates, not cut them, as we've all been hoping?
Well, already, Peter, you can see in Australia's economy that inflation is higher than what it was anticipated to be. And that's already led many to suggest the Reserve Bank will delay interest rate cuts until sometime next year. In fact, the interesting thing for government right now as to whether the first interest rate cut will eventually come after the time of the next election, because you got some sense that maybe the timing of that first interest rate cut might have come with when the election was going to take place. But just a few numbers for you. And that is the tax cuts themselves, the reformed Stage 3 tax cuts over the forward estimates, so 4 years, were worth $105 billion. So the first part of that, let's call it $25 billion, to be pumped into Australia's economy when they get handed down. Now, Australia has around $2.2 trillion worth of mortgages. And so it's often said that the value of a 1 percentage point cut in interest rates, so from, say, 5% down to 4%, 6% down to 5%, the value of that is worth around, guess what, $25 billion. And so, therefore, the value of the first year of the Stage 3 tax cuts, though they go on and on and on, is almost precisely the same, give or take, as a 1 percentage point cut in the interest rates. And that would be, I would suggest, one reason why the Reserve Bank would have good justification for stopping, not necessarily raising interest rates as some say, although that's got to be an option on the table, but most certainly waiting and seeing what the impact of these tax cuts will be on A, inflation, and B, people spending.
That's a worry, because I think a lot of people are banking on them coming down, and certainly that had been in the political projections of the government. What about the report this week? I've been running it pretty hard. The $1 billion payment to this quantum computer company, it's based in California. Of course, it will build, it says, a computer in Brisbane, 400 new jobs. I've worked that out. That's a cost of about $2.5 million per Brisbane-based job. A whole lot of unanswered questions, Ross, today about the secret process that got this private company, only registered in Australia last year, such a massive payday. And these are not questions from journalists coming. They're from, expert academics. I quoted before a professor at AI at the University of New South Wales. I mean, there are probity concerns here now, I think.
There's a few concerns, one of which is, how does the government know that this is actually the best project to invest in? I mean, there are the very best investors in this country that I've been talking to, and they say they're not quite certain. Would they actually put $1 billion worth of their investors' money into something such as this? They say, well, we're not too certain we would, because we're not too certain of the payday. I did notice also, actually just in passing today, that the Danish government, which has got massive amounts of reserves as a result of the weight loss drugs Ozempic and Wegovy. The manufacturer of those is a Danish company, and so it's now investing its own money into, guess what, quantum computing, just as the United States, the UK, every other major developed economy is in this same arms race almost to try and get the first of these quantum computers. And yet the reality is that these quantum computers are still sort of unproven technology. They are the type of thing which, if somebody does crack it, will really change the nature of where medical science and cryptology in terms of encryption of our data goes to into the future. But the reality is it is a massive punt. Now, good on the government for being there, but the reality is, have they actually picked the right horse? Because there are others, including a former Australian of the Year, who also are delving into this area, who might have also been worthy of some consideration.
Well, I think there's a massive payday, though, for all those Labor staffers now turned lobbyists involved in going back to their old bosses to get them to sign onto this deal. And I think that's going to come out in the days ahead. Let's go to the other big news today. Defence Minister Richard Marles, well, he's gone out and said that he's on board with the potential takeover of our biggest homegrown defence company. This is the massive WA shipbuilder called Austal. The would-be buyer's a South Korean company. The government says, look, we'll not stand in the way of this proposed billion-dollar deal. Now, sure, they've got extensive US government contracts. They're likely to be involved in AUKUS, but they're still a foreign company. And as we saw with that Qenos, the plastics manufacturer, collapse, it isn't who we sell Australian companies to now that's the problem. It's who they then get sold on to after that. And I've got to ask the question, I mean, what if this Korean mob was to sell Austal down the track to a Chinese company? Do we really want our military shipbuilder in the hands of Beijing?
Well, there is a decent question. And given the fact that Jim Chalmers himself last year knocked back a lithium takeover, only a small one, but a lithium takeover to a Chinese company, that again raises questions about, well, who are you going to let in and who are you not? And then it comes down to sovereign capability. Surely Australia should have some sovereign capability of its own. That seems pretty clear because remember that, yes, it's okay to have partners. Yes, it's okay to have friends. But do bear in mind that 5 and 6 years ago, there was a lot of Chinese investment in highly sensitive areas in this country. The big brave decision that was made was by Josh Frydenberg in rejecting a Chinese ownership of Australian Pipelines Authority, the old one called APA Group. Now that controlled all the gas pipelines of Australia. That was itself a very strong and very brave decision at the time that caused repercussions from China. But it is really now a situation where you've got to make certain Australia has its own sovereign capability. The one thing about this deal, I can tell you, is the Americans also have to sign off on it, and that'll be more interesting.
Well, we hope for the Americans there, Ross. Thank you for your time. After the break, that attempt by the Prime Minister today to say he's not responsible for any criminals that get bailed or that their ankle bracelets get removed, well, that's not what his own legislation says. Shadow Attorney General Nicolle Flint up next. Plus the court case involving Indigenous Australians that, if successful, could have huge ramifications for our climate policies. More on that soon. Welcome back to Lakama. A legal expert with over 40 years' experience is going to weigh in on that decision to drop all criminal charges over Victoria's 800 hotel quarantine deaths. But first, let's get back into the detainee disaster, because we're now at the point where Labor's trying to pass the buck and blame the bureaucrats. In this instance, the Community Safety Board, which the PM says is independent of the government. Well, wrong. The board provides advice and recommendations to the government, but in the end, it's the ministers who make the decisions. Joining me now to discuss this, Shadow Attorney General Nicolle Flint. Well, Senator, thank you for your time. The PM today tried to blame the bureaucracy, but his own legislation says that everything this board might recommend still must be signed off by the minister. So either he doesn't know his own laws or he's being deliberately misleading here in the hope he can avoid responsibility for the latest chapter in this unholy crisis. So what is it, do you think?
Well, Peter, Mr Albanese, as Prime Minister of this country, must sleep very well at night, knowing that it does not matter what goes wrong under his government. It's not his responsibility, it's not the minister's responsibility, it is somebody else's responsibility. That is not the case. He has one responsibility as a Prime Minister, the first and foremost, to keep Australia and Australians safe. His government has actively made policy decisions that have made Australians less safe. But on top of that, his government is now actively making decisions which are ensuring that Australians are at risk. And the Nanette Simons case in my home state of Western Australia is the perfect example. Mr Albanese needs to front the Australian people and clearly explain to them why the Commonwealth prosecutors did not oppose bail. Peter, a story has also just broken that actually has the transcript of the proceedings, and the Crown prosecutor in these proceedings said they had concerns that this particular detainee would re-offend. However, they would still not oppose bail. Mr Albanese and the Attorney-General of this country have very serious questions to answer because, yes, it is their responsibility and they cannot abrogate it.
But Kelly, you're right to point out that was the case on the 20th of February, but I've gone through it tonight. On the 10th of April, so just over a month later, he was charged again, bailed again. The 14th of April, charged again, bailed again. And 2 days later, from that last chance they had to lock him up, so 3 times this year, he's fronted court and they've bailed him. 2 days on from that last case of the 14th of April, he allegedly attacked Nanette Simons. I mean, 3 strikes, you're out, I reckon.
Oh, well, it gets worse. The Attorney-General, as you know, under the Director of Public Prosecutions Act, Section 8, actually has the ability to provide a direction to the Commonwealth DPP. I hope the Attorney-General has sought advice as to whether or not he can exercise his powers in this regard, because if he hasn't, he himself is deficient. This is squarely at the feet of Mr Albanese. His government, in the first instance, made the policy decision to release this in excess of 150 hardcore criminals. That was their decision. Their Crown prosecutors are now actively making decisions to not oppose bail, despite exactly what you have just said. So Mr Albanese can throw as many bureaucrats under the bus as he likes. What that shows the Australian people is they have a weak Prime Minister who, as I said, he must sleep very well at night, Peter, knowing that under his government, it doesn't matter what goes wrong, he's going to blame someone else.
I want to show people at home the salaries that this Community Safety Board receive.
Yep.
I mean, I think Community Safety Board's an oxymoron because no one's safe, no one's getting locked up, everyone seems to get bail.
Safe.
Look at those salaries there on the screen. I mean, they are big salaries. But I think what's worse, you sat late in the Senate last year, going into Christmas, to get this legislation urgently through, we were told, these preventative detention orders. Well, 6 months on, they haven't put one preventative detention order in.
There are no words now for the incompetence of this government, in particular given what has occurred to Nanette Simons in my home state. But Peter, let's stop blaming the Community Safety Board because, as you said in your opening, the minister or his delegate do not need to rubber stamp the advice that is given to them or the recommendation by the Community Safety Board. At law, the minister or his delegate are the ones who make the decision, which means at law, either the minister or his delegate had to personally have the state of mind that the wearing of the ankle bracelet was not reasonably necessary to protect any part of the Australian community. That is the state of mind that either the minister or his delegate themselves held. And as a result, Nanette Simons was brutally assaulted in her home. The pictures now, which will haunt Australians, quite frankly, for weeks and months to come. So let's put aside blaming the Community Safety Board. The minister or his delegate themselves needed to form the particular state of mind, and they did that with a disastrous result. So Mr Albanese, I assume, has hauled his minister in and has hauled the delegate in and said, I have to say it this way, Peter, what the hell happened? How in God's name did you form this state of mind? It was your state of mind. You formed it. Now, explain it to me, because it has been disastrous in what has now occurred. That is squarely at the feet of this minister, Minister Giles.
I want to say this is the last time we're going to have to talk about this issue, but I suspect it will go on and on as it has.
Oh, it won't be, Peter. It won't be.
8 or 9
it won't
months.
Be.
Nicolle Cash, I've got to leave it there. Thank you as always. All right, Senator Cash there. Let's go now to that hearing. The closing arguments at the moment in the federal court case this week brought by 2 traditional owners who are suing the federal government for, quote, failing in its duty of care to protect their ancestral lands from the impacts of climate change. Now, somewhat ironically, Stephen Lloyd SC, acting for the Commonwealth, told the court that Australia has no control over global climate change, saying that, quote, we control Commonwealth emissions to some extent. The risk of harm is global climate change. For more on this, I'm joined now by the Environment Editor for The Australian, Graham Lloyd. Well, hello. We've waited a long time to understand that Australia doesn't have a temperature gauge of its own, that we are part of a global climate. But take us through the ramifications, if you can, Graham. What will happen if this case is successful?
Well, good evening, Peter, and it is a remarkable and refreshing concession from the Commonwealth. But this case is really part of a broader international push, if you like, in the sort of lawfare front and climate change. It's trying to get the courts to supervise governments and to insist that they put their climate policies in line with, they say, the science, which really means to be in line with achieving a global temperature rise limit of 1.5 degrees. We saw a case recently in Sweden where the European Court found that the Swedish government had been negligent in not doing enough. We now have this case in the Torres Strait where there may be some compensation that's sought, but the bigger issue for environment groups is to get that court supervision of how the government frames its policies.
Look, just before we go off this issue, Eraring announced this week or speculated this week, it's meant to close next year. It may run on for another 4 years plus, 150 million a year, we're told. Remind everyone at home, what's going to happen if Eraring just closes down as planned next year?
Well, it's becoming increasingly obvious that the electricity system is fragile, that the baseload supplies from coal generation in particular are going to need to be there for longer than people had expected to hold it all together. So as we've discussed over several months, the New South Wales government really has a gun to its head as it negotiates with the owners of Eraring. The estimates are now that it will cost $150 million a year to keep it operating. Those figures haven't been decided, but the alternative is almost too bleak to compensate, to consider.
Yeah, it's shocking. We're on tenterhooks there in New South Wales, certainly. Graham Lloyd, thank you. Right after the break. Nearly 800 people died as a result of Victoria's hotel quarantine chaos, and now not one charge has been laid. In fact, they have now been dismissed. A former Chief Crown Prosecutor weighs in after the break. Plus, shameless vote buying with your money from Queensland Premier Stephen Miles. More on that coming up. Well, welcome back. Still to come. It's now official, isn't it? Nicolle Flint's going to have another crack at federal politics. We'll chat to her in a moment. But first, the criminal case against the Victorian Health Department over hotel quarantine failures, which led to just under the deaths of 800 Victorians, is now collapsed in a heap. The state's Office of Public Prosecutions has dropped 58 criminal charges against the Health Department, which had been brought forward by WorkSafe, citing a county court ruling that found 10 witness statements to the court inquiry were inadmissible. An OPP spokesman said, and I quote, the court's ruling was that these witness statements provided to the inquiry on the department's behalf. Now, for that reason, the court ruled the evidence arising from those statements to the inquiry was not then admissible against the department in a criminal proceeding. So while Victoria went it alone with dodgy private security guards, were interstate, they used military personnel, there's still no sign that anyone will be held accountable for the deaths that resulted. Joining me now to help us all understand what's happened here, Mr Gavin Silbert, a barrister with 40 years' experience, who also served as Victoria's Chief Crown Prosecutor from 2008 to 2018. Well, Gavin, thank you. I guess we're all at a loss as to why we can have around 800 people die. There's a nexus from the Court inquiry findings between those deaths and hotel quarantine. And now there's this inadmissibility of witness statements. OK, if there's a problem with those witness statements and the Court inquiry, why don't we just get those witness statements taken again?
Well, the witness statements should have been taken in the first place because there's a basic rule that evidence produced to inquiries, whether they're royal commissions or commissions of inquiry, subject to what's called immunity, and they cannot be used. There's a basic principle against self-incrimination. Our normal freedoms forbid us being subjected to any sort of interrogation. An accused on trial in a criminal court does not have to give evidence. These inquiries make it compulsory to give evidence, but they put the protection in that in order to protect the right against self-incrimination, that whatever is said cannot be used other than in that inquiry.
OK, so go back to 2020,
yes.
When they had the inquiry, and obviously from that came these 10 individuals, they would have known then that they could not use those witness statements to the inquiry as statements to run a criminal prosecution.
Absolutely.
They would have known that.
Absolutely.
So why didn't they take those statements again?
Well, they should have been taken again.
Yep.
Every other Royal Commission, I know the War Crimes Commission has not looked at the Brereton inquiry. I know that the Nicolle Commission, which was disgracefully shut down by the DPP effectively, did not look at the McMurdo Royal Commission. It's a basic principle that what's compulsorily obtained in a Royal Commission or a Commission of Inquiry cannot be used, and you have to take them again.
OK, so they didn't take them again?
Yes, they should have taken them again.
Why can't they take them again now?
Well, there's a statute of limitations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which I think is 2 years, and I think they've run out of time. I think
or someone like me will say they deliberately ran the clock down.
Well, you can say that, and I can't comment on that, but they've certainly run out of time. They should have been taken again immediately, and then almost the same statements could have been produced in support of the indictment in the county court.
So they had them. They should have done them again.
Yes.
They didn't. We now find out that they haven't done them, so we say do them now. They say too late, we're past the statutory period. Are we ever going to get justice or anyone held responsible now, given we've passed this milestone?
Very, very doubtful as far as any criminal prosecution goes. The answer is no, I think.
We know there's a civil case going on, but I mean, you mentioned there the McMurdo Royal Commission. This is obviously into the Nicola Gobbo police informant issue.
Yes.
Jeffrey Nettle was a former judge, was made a special investigator there.
Yes.
He recommended that the DPP in Victoria lay charges against the police involved there.
Yes.
The same DPP that's not running criminal charges now in hotel quarantine is still the same DPP who hasn't prosecuted anyone out of the Gobbo matter.
Absolutely, that's right. And you've got upper echelons of Victoria Police who presumably are guilty of criminal conduct who have not been prosecuted. You've got Gobbo who offered to give evidence and offered to plead guilty, has not been prosecuted. So go figure.
Is there something crook with justice in Victoria?
Yes, there is.
What needs to happen?
Well, there probably should be some sort of independent inquiry into the things, because there's a litany of failures, perhaps commencing with Pell, but then going from Pell through to the McMurdo Royal Commission. Then we've got the recent Justice Lasry episode with the Judicial Commission. There are certainly things wrong that need to be looked at.
And we saw when he departed IBAC some very strong comments from the former IBAC Commissioner about politicisation and involvement.
Absolutely.
I mean, Queensland cleaned up its act
with
the Fitzgerald Royal Commission.
Yes.
Are we at that stage here in Victoria?
We may well be. We've been very close to it.
Gee, well, you're an eminent person to have made that comment. Thank you, Gavin Silbert.
It's a pleasure.
There you go. Victoria needs a Royal Commission to clean up its justice, and that's from a former head of the DPP in Victoria. All right, after the break, Nicolle Flint and why she's fighting to win back her old seat of Boothby at the next election. Plus a huge jump in the number of students identifying as non-binary. It's up 20 times on where it was just a few years back. Welcome back. Let's bring in the panel. Former Liberal MP, soon to be back in power if she can get there, Nicolle Flint, and Pauline Hanson's Chief of Staff, James Ashby. Well, Nicolle, you're certainly the woman of the hour today. A big call, the tight marginal seat. Why the heck do you want to have another go again?
Well, Peter, there are a few reasons. First of all, I had a major health breakthrough in December. I've finally found medication that has my endometriosis under control. So honestly, I feel like I've got a second chance at life, which is a pretty remarkable thing to be able to say and to be able to feel. Secondly, I am just so concerned for Australians under this Albanese Labor government. People are not better off. My community in Boothby, my wonderful community, are all suffering cost of living pressures, whether it's households, families, and particularly our amazing small businesses, and we have to get things back on track for them. And I truly believe that Peter Dutton is the person to do that. You know, Peter Dutton is the one person who will keep Australians safe at every level, and we've had an absolutely shocking week this week, Peter. Peter Dutton is the person to help fix this mess and also help fix the economic mess that the Labor government have made of our beautiful country.
Look, I know you put a brave face on it, but your endometriosis crippled you for many years, and it's something a lot of Australian women suffer, so I'm really pleased to hear that good news. And I know you'll fight hard in the campaign. We'll talk to you about issues in South Australia from here on in, as well as many other things. But let's go up to Queensland, if I can, with you, James. Your Premier up there has pledged to cut everyone's power bill by $1,000 ahead of the October election. I mean, I reckon this is an absolute blatant vote buy. This money's not means tested. It's doing absolutely nothing about getting the prices down. It's a subsidy to taxpayers, paid for by taxpayers, meaning it's nothing more than a money go round, isn't it?
Yeah, the Premier is acting more like a sugar daddy, but most Queenslanders are no cheap date, and we won't accept the fact that this isn't means tested. Look, the problem we've got here in Queensland, Peter, is there's only 3 sitting weeks left between now and the October 26 election here in Queensland. So there's not a great deal that this Premier, Stephen Miles, and the Labor Party can actually do to effect change on the floor of Parliament. So what they're doing is they're going out and buying your vote. And I hope the Queenslanders aren't silly enough to just lap this up. There's a reason why we've got high electricity prices in this state. Just weeks ago, the Labor Party, supported by the Liberal National Party, helped support the Net Zero program. And they've put into legislation now a target to reduce carbon emissions by 75% by 2035. These are the issues. That's what's driving electricity prices up in this state. Forget your handouts. Get rid of net zero. We'll be in a whole lot better economic position if we do that.
You're not wrong, but I also reckon you're a bit cheeky to stand there beside a pool with your short sleeves on. I've got my Ugg boots out down here in Melbourne. I tell you, it's cold. Queensland looks good. Nicolle, reports today, a number of school students are being enrolled as non-binary, so neither male or female. Certainly they are male or female, but they're not identifying as either male or female. Well, those numbers have skyrocketed since the pandemic. Last year, it was around 2,500 kids enrolling as non-binary. Compare that to 2019, and it was 128. Now, teachers are also being told, don't refer to boys or girls as girls. Drop that nomenclature altogether. An example, the Tasmanian Department for Education, it's got instructions out to teachers that says, whenever possible, use gender-neutral language and terms that recognise gender equity. Try student or child instead of boy or girl. What do you make of this?
Peter, these are such a significant increase in numbers. I really think we need to have a very careful and respectful inquiry as to why and what is driving this change with young people. We've just seen the Cass review come out of the UK, which has raised a range of really important questions that need to be asked and answered here in Australia, because ultimately we need to be looking out for these young people and making sure that they're keeping themselves safe. And particularly for young women, and you've just mentioned my battle with endometriosis, You can't deny your biological reality. And it is absolutely crucial that we make sure that young women in particular are educated about what their bodies do and how they do it and what's normal and what isn't. And if kids are identifying as non-binary, are we even able to do that with them? You know, we need to have a careful, respectful inquiry into why this is happening and what we can do to support these young people.
James, I'm almost out of time, but a quick one. All these university protests, we've seen them in the US, we've seen them here. But in Australia, we had one protest flying the Palestinian Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestinian flag. Now, that mob is an outlaw terror organisation. I didn't think you could have anything on display linked to them.
No, that's 100% right. And anyone supporting a terrorist group in this country can face up to 25 years in prison. The university should shut these down. They're a place for learning, not protest. These sorts of protests in Brisbane got to end.
Got to end. I'll leave it there, both of you. Good luck, Nicolle. Enjoy nice weather, James Ashby. I'll see you both next week. That's it for me. See you on Monday. Up next, Andrew Bolt.